Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Meredith Glasgow, and I'm a procurement specialist with the Connecticut Apex Accelerator, or CT Apex. Thank you all for taking the time to join our presentation in collaboration with Totem Technologies. This will be a presentation on small businesses and CMMC. Please note that all the attendees are muted, and if you have a question throughout the presentation, please submit it in the Q&A box and we will be addressing those at the end of the presentation. The webinar materials will be emailed to you after the conclusion. First, an overview of our program here at CT Apex. We offer assistance with education in regards to the perplexity of government contracting, including assistance with federal, state, and local contracting regulations, socioeconomic certifications, researching procurement histories and forecasts, and creating government-friendly marketing materials. We have offices all across the state of Connecticut, including East Hartford, Rocky Hill, New Haven, Milford, Bridgeport, and our headquarters is in Groton, Connecticut. Feel free to follow us at CT Apex on social media, including Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can register for assistance online at ctapex.org. CT Apex is funded in part through a cooperative agreement with the Department of Defense, in addition to receiving funds from the state of Connecticut, the Department of Economic and Community Development. We are hosted by the Southeastern Connecticut Enterprise Region, or sector. We have many strategic partners that allow us to do what we do and allow a value add to the services that we provide. And today we're very thankful to have one of our strategic partners and a guest presenter here from Totem Technologies, Adam Austin. Thank you for being here with us today. Adam is a cybersecurity lead at Totem Tech. Mr. Austin has over a decade of experience securing classified, unclassified, and HIPAA environment U.S. government IT systems. He's worked with NASA, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Systems, and all branches of DoD. Adam holds a master's in information assurance from Capital Technology University and is an ISACA certified information security manager and a certified information systems auditor. And on top of that is now a cybersecurity maturity model certification registered practitioner, or CMMC RP. Adam's goal is to leverage his experience in education to help small businesses and regulatory environments implement affordable, compliant, and risk-based cybersecurity programs. So again, we are thankful to have him here with his expertise today. And again, welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Meredith. I'm going to share my screen just to confirm you can hear me okay.
Absolutely.
All right, let me share my screen and then we'll get going. I really appreciate it. And just confirming you can see my screen now too.
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Meredith, and thanks to the rest of the Connecticut Apex Accelerator team. We are big fans of the Apex Accelerator mission. In fact, we are a former Apex Accelerator client ourselves. So Totem Technologies is a daughter company, if you will, to another company called Hate Bay and Associates. We're both co-located in Utah, north of Salt Lake City in West Haven, Utah. I'm coming to you from our offices in Utah. Hate Bay and Associates was founded in 2014 to pursue a small business set-aside contract with the U.S. Air Force, a logistics contract for Air Force weather sensing system. With the massive help of our Apex accelerators, back then they were called PTAC, Procurement Technical Assistance Centers. With a lot of help from them, we were able to put together a winning proposal and won a 5-year IDIQ contract with the Air Force to perform logistics services. In 2016, our first option year on that contract, the Air Force introduced a new clause into our contract, the DFARS. So there are a lot of acronyms in this presentation, so I'll make sure I do my best to expand all those acronyms. The Department of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, DFARS, 252-204-7012, that required us to implement a cybersecurity program to protect certain types of unclassified information that we were handling on this contract. And we don't, the contract itself does not allow us to handle classified information. It does not mandate that we handle classified information. So secret, top secret, confidential. We don't handle any of that. We do handle a lot of unclassified information. And since 2016, we've been obligated to protect that information. When we first took a look at the requirements, we knew they were going to be a challenge for small business. And as we sort of started our compliance journey and building out a cybersecurity program, we brought our subcontractors along with us, and a lot of the subs needed uh, additional help, a lot of help. It's very challenging, especially for subcontractors and lower tier suppliers and vendors. And so a light bulb went off, and we thought, okay, well, maybe we form a separate business to help our peers along their compliance journey, and that separate business is Totem Technologies. So again, we're very appreciative of the Apex Accelerator mission. It helped us put us on our journey that has led here to where we are today. So Totem Technologies is a primarily business to business consulting firm in the arena of government contractor cybersecurity. Those of us in the Department of Defense supply chain, what's known as the Defense Industrial Base, or DIB, face forthcoming almost here regulation called the CMMC, which is going to hold us accountable for meeting the contractual mandates that have been put into contracts since at least 2016. The DFARS 7012 clause is an example of those, and we'll look at the other clauses here today, as well as sort of scratch the surface on what the requirements are. But what we want to focus on today is a general overview of this accountability method that the DoD has put in place, the CMMC, and the level of efforts, the level of effort that small business can expect as they pursue CMMC certification. I want to note, though, that all of the requirements, the contractual requirements that we'll be talking about today, uh, exist across the federal government space. It's not just for DoD contractors. It's just that the DoD is the first of the executive branch agencies to put a accountability method in place to hold our feet to the fire, so to speak, to make sure that as the contracting supply chain that is privileged to handle information on behalf of the DoD by executing contracts, to make sure that we're meeting our contractual obligations. So even if you're not in the Department of Defense contracting space, know that the requirements pertain to you, and something like the CMMC is going to be adopted by all the federal executive branch agencies sooner than later. In fact, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, they've already started talking about similar programs to the CMMC. So without further ado, I'm going to turn on my pointer here and get going through our presentation. There is an adage in the cybersecurity profession that there is no such thing as one size fits all security. There are cybersecurity standards, and we'll talk about a couple of those today, that we can comply with. So we can align a cybersecurity program to a standard, but it doesn't necessarily represent the best security for our particular company in our particular industry doing the particular work that we do. So that's a sort of adage, as I said. However, the DoD says, okay, well, faced with the fact that much of our supply chain, maybe most of it, and there are 220,000 companies in the DIB. That's the DoD's estimates. Some would say there are more. There are 220,000 of us. Most of us are small businesses. So this is tier 1 prime contractors, tier 2 subcontractors, and then tier 3 and below suppliers and vendors. 220,000 of us. Most of us don't have any coherent cybersecurity program to speak of. So when faced with the overall lack of cybersecurity throughout the industry, forcing us to align, to build a cybersecurity program aligned with a cybersecurity standard, in other words, to comply, is better than nothing. And the nothing currently is represented pretty viscerally by the comparison of these images on the slide that I'm showing. So on the bottom, you have two images of so United States and some of our allies, fifth generation fighter, the F-35 Lightning II. The prime contractor is Lockheed Martin, and there are thousands of members of the F-35 supply chain. On the top, you have what the Chinese have designated the J-35, their copycat knockoff version of the F-35. And it's not a coincidence that it looks very similar. And everything that we can understand about it is that it performs very similarly to the F-35 as well. It's not a coincidence because the Chinese have overtly stolen much of the information relating to the F-35. So research and development information, the development took place over 30 plus years. Stole R&D information, stole information on how to manufacture and assemble the thing, stole information on how to operate and maintain it, stole information on how to train pilots. And they stole this information not just through old-fashioned boots on the ground spy work, but also maybe primarily through cyber attack, active hacking, but also more subtle attacks such as through phishing emails where they entice a user to click on a link or download an attachment or respond with some credentials. The adversary gets a foothold in that environment and then absconds with sensitive information. And they target the entirety of the supply chain, not just Lockheed Martin. And it has obviously led to a compromise in military technology. And this is but one of dozens of examples of copycat knockoff military tech. There are also plenty of commercial examples as well. So China has a commercial airliner that is virtually identical to the Boeing 737, as well as Airbus airliners as well. And because they've stolen the information related to the development of this technology, they can produce their systems for an order of magnitude cheaper. So it costs them about 10 million to produce the J-35. It costs us about 100 million as taxpayers for each F-35. So there's a huge problem here. We are collectively hemorrhaging intellectual property. That hemorrhaging leads to significant military competitive advantage compromise, and the DoD, because their mission is life and death, they have to do something about this. They have to force the industrial base to align to a cybersecurity standard. So the forcing of aligning to a standard has actually existed in contracts for almost, well, maybe even more than 10 years now. The CMMC is the accountability method, the verification method to verify that we're doing what we've been contractually obligated to, because apparently many of us have not been meeting those contractual obligations. So let's talk about what those contractual obligations are. This slide is a little busy, it's verbose, but it's quickly become my favorite slide of this presentation, actually all my presentations, because it encapsulates the current state of affairs, the very near state of affairs as well, and identifies the contractual clauses that you need to be looking out for that obligate you to put in place a cybersecurity program. So currently, all members of the defense industrial base, all 220,000 plus of us, with the exceptions of those of us that provide COTS items, so commercial off-the-shelf items, or that produce goods and services below the micro purchase threshold, which I believe is 17,000. The Apex Accelerator counselors that are on with us can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I believe the micro purchase threshold is 17,000. So everybody else that doesn't either provide COTS or has contracts below the micro purchase threshold handles something called federal contract information, the definition of which is extremely broad. It is essentially all information related to the execution of the federal contract, no matter if you're a tier 1 prime or a subcontractor or supplier or vendor down in the supply chain. All information related to the execution of that contract, except for what's called simple transactional information, which is information about how we get paid, like our invoices to our customer. We all handle FCI. And FCI includes the contract itself, subcontracts, purchase orders, delivery orders, performance work statements, reports that are generated for the execution, communications about the execution of the contract, including emails, and certainly written documentation about the execution. So your email communication with downstream with your customer or upstream with your suppliers and vendors is considered FCI if it's about the contract. So very broad definition. There is a FAR clause, so Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause 52-204-21, that mandates all federal government contractors, whether they're in DoD or not, in the DIB or not, that we implement certain basic cybersecurity protections to protect FCI. The 52-204-21 clause calls out 15 subclauses, basic cybersecurity protections that range in a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have requirements to physically secure the facilities that are used to handle the FCI or the systems that handle FCI. So we need to make sure that we have locks on doors and windows, alarm systems, intrusion detection systems, visitor escort protocols, logged access by staff into the facility so we know when someone has entered. So on one end of the spectrum, you have these physical security requirements. On the other end of the spectrum, you have logical or digital requirements, such as making sure that we operate a firewall at our network boundary where our network connects to the internet, making sure that we have endpoint protection or antivirus software installed on all of our endpoints, so mobile devices, workstations, and servers. And then, so you have these sort of two ends of the spectrum, physical and logical or digital, and then 15 other things to do within that spectrum. So if you think about a rainbow, you have like 15 different colors in that rainbow, things to do to protect FCI. Another analogy I like to use is we sort of need to build a castle to protect crown jewels. The FCI in this case is the crown jewels, and we need to build a figurative castle to protect those crown jewels. FAR 52-204-21 is the specifications for that basic castle to protect FCI. And if you think about a castle, you think about the defensive mechanisms that a castle employs: moat, drawbridge, sentries, tall, thick, strong walls, so on and so forth. That's why there's more than one cybersecurity protection called out in the FAR clause. There's 15. So this FAR clause has been around for a long time, at least 10 years. It's been in contracts that long. It's required to go into all contracts and flow down through all subcontract vehicles. So it's been around. The CMMC, for those of us in the Department of Defense supply chain, CMMC Level 1 will require us to self-assess our implementation of that standard, of that specification, and report directly to the DoD the results of that assessment, as well as report or have a senior official at our organization affirm that the assessment was accurate and that we can maintain the implementation of that program going forward. In other words, we need to report on the state of our castle and have somebody in the organization affirm that the castle is in good working order. And we're going to need to do that every year under CMMC Level 1. And we'll look at a timeline here in a minute. CMMC Level 1, CMMC is almost ready to be rolled out into contracts. So that's for FCI. There is a more sensitive subset of FCI called Controlled Unclassified Information, or CUI. CUI is FCI of a technical or mission-related nature. So those of us that are in manufacturing and build tangible widgets that we supply to a customer that eventually are put into some DoD system, whether it's an IT system or a weapons system or a sensing system or a mission enablement system. The technical information related to those widgets, so drawings, travelers or work instructions for how the thing is manufactured or assembled, quality and conformance reports. All of that information is considered controlled considered controlled unclassified information. As long as it doesn't reach the level of classification, top secret, secret, or confidential, it's considered controlled unclassified information. Any international traffic in arms regulated ITAR information and several other types of export controlled information are also considered CUI. So in addition to Department of State requirements, you have CUI protection requirements as well for that ITAR. And then you have mission related information as well. So for our parent company, Haight Bay and Associates, we perform a logistics contract, and part of our duties is shipping parts for the Air Force all around the world. Some of those shipping locations, when they're in sensitive forward operating locations, would definitely reveal the DoD's mission if that information fell into the adversary's hands. And so the shipping locations themselves are considered CUI, interestingly enough. Again, here COTS and micro purchase threshold contracts are exempt from the obligations to protect the CUI, but we do have additional obligations to protect CUI. The Department of Defense has a specific contractual clause. I mentioned this before, 252-204-7012, what we call DFAR 7012 for short, obligates us, and this clause goes into all contracts, all DoD contracts, and it's expected to be flowed down through all contracts, all subcontracts. This requires us to build a bigger, better castle. It requires us, in addition to implementing 52-204-21, to implement a National Institutes of Standards and Technology special publication 800-171. So there are 15 basic cyber protections for FCI. 800-171 has 110 cybersecurity safeguards that we have to put in place for CUI. It's an order of magnitude increase in the amount of stuff we have to do. And it requires a much more complex cybersecurity program, a much more complex castle, if you will. And you're not going to be able to build a complex castle like the one required by 800-171 unless you plan accordingly, plan sufficiently. So we need to maintain currently several different types of plans. A system security plan, or SSP, that's like the set of blueprints for our cybersecurity program or our castle. Plan of action and milestones. So that's a plan that describes how we're going to take those blueprints and make them a reality. Also, it's an ongoing living, breathing document and describes how we correct deficiencies in our cybersecurity program when we discover them. So that's a POAM, plan of action and milestones. We also need the ability to identify adversarial behavior, what we call incidents, and report those incidents directly to the DoD. No matter where we are in the supply chain, we have to report to the DoD, not necessarily our customer, okay? Not necessarily the primes. And we need an incident response plan, or IRP, to maintain that. And there's also a slew of other what we call artifacts or supplemental types of documents that support these plans. So it's quite complex undertaking. If we go back to that spectrum analogy, we have the same spectrum in NIST 800-171. We have physical protection on one end and logical or digital protection on the other end. There's just a lot more colors to that rainbow. DFAR 7012 has been around for 10 years or so, been in contracts that long. As I mentioned, we saw it in our contract first in 2016. The CMMC is in part a verification and accountability method for DFAR 7012. So in the very near future, we will start seeing contractual obligations for those of us that handle CUI. In addition to an annual self-assessment, we'll have to, every 3 years, achieve a CMMC Level 2 certification that is awarded by a third party. So we'll have to hire a third party assessment organization to assess our implementation of the 800-171 standard every 3 years. And that's not going to be free. We'll have to pay for that. So we're going to talk about resources that it takes to get to that point as part of the presentation today. So I'm going to skip ahead a slide and then I'll come back to the CMMC model. I just want to reiterate that what we're talking about here is an information-centric exercise. The types of information that you handle or can expect to handle by virtue of executing any aspect of a federal government contract uh, dictates which cybersecurity safeguards you need to implement. All of us, all federal government contractors handle FCI. A subset of us handle CUI, which is a subset of FCI. CUI is a more technical or mission related type of information. Those of us working in the defense supply chain, the DIB, the DoD likes to make things complicated. They call CUI that is handled under a defense contract or a defense program CDI, covered defense information. CDI is just CUI that's handled in a DoD program. And there are a myriad of categories of CUI that the NARA, National Archives and Records Administration, is actually in charge of oversight of the federal government CUI program. And they've identified 125 or so categories of CUI. Some are handled under other executive branch contracts, like Department of Education student financial records are considered CUI under a Department of Ed contract. Department of Justice has its own CUI categories. Department of Energy has its own. But for those of us in the DIB, typically we would handle one of 6 types of CUI. I mentioned all export control, all ITAR and much other export control information is already also considered CUI. OPSEC is mission-related CUI, so our shipping locations are considered operations security type of CUI. There's a couple of nuclear categories, naval nuclear propulsion specifically, and then a general unclassified controlled nuclear technologies information. Critical infrastructure security is information about the DoD facilities and bases themselves. So those of us that perform maintenance on DoD bases or that are in general construction, general contracting and construction type of contracts, we very likely will handle critical infrastructure security CUI. The biggest catch-all category of CUI is controlled technical information. This is all of the information related to how a widget is manufactured or assembled for the DoD, or how software, source code, or executable code, that's all considered controlled technical information as well. In the DoD space, in the DIB, those of us that just handle federal contract information will only be subject to level 1, CMMC level 1, but those of us that handle CUI will be subject to CMMC level 2 or level 3. So looking at the CMMC model, it's depicted here. CMMC is a stratified model. It's got 3 different layers or levels. All DIB members are subject to CMMC level 1, except for COTS providers or providers below the micro purchase threshold. All of us will need to do an annual self-assessment of our implementation of the 52.204.21 standard and report the results of that assessment as well as an affirmation through the Supplier Performance Risk System, SPRS, to the DoD. We have blogs and workshops on how to get access to the SPRS system. Our website is totem.tech, and you can look at the blogs, and we're constantly putting out information on specifics of cybersecurity with the DoD and federal government. So I won't go too deep down the rabbit hole of how to do the assessment or reporting today. Just know that it's a requirement, or soon will be a requirement. We'll look at a timeline in the next slide. The DoD estimates that of the 220,000 of us, 138,000 small businesses only need to meet CMMC level 1. We all need to meet it, but 138,000 of us only need to meet it. The rest of us, 60,000 or so, 60,000 plus, handle CUI, controlled unclassified information. Again, that is FCI of a technical or mission-related nature. As such, we are obligated by the DFAR 7012 clause to implement the revision 2 of the 800-171 standard, which has 110 safeguards. We are also, or soon will be, obligated to hire every 3 years, hire a what's called CMMC third-party assessment organization, C3PAO, to do an independent, objective evaluation, verification assessment of our implementation of this standard. And we will need a near perfect assessment in order to pass this assessment and be awarded a certificate, a certification at level 2 by the C3PAO. In addition, every year, a senior official at our organization is going to have to affirm that the system, and when I use the word system, I mean facilities that handle CUI or the IT systems that handle CUI, the IT system hardware, software, networking devices, the people, and the cloud services that we use to handle our CUI. So when I use that term system, that's what we mean. The annual affirmation, the official is going to have to affirm that that system as assessed is still, and the cybersecurity program related to that system is still in good working order. In other words, that our castle as built and as assessed is still in proper working order. A very small subset of us, about 5% or 3,000 of us, will actually not have to go hire a C3PO. We'll be able to do a self-assessment every 3 years. I would not count on being one of that very small cadre of self-assessment organizations. The DoD program managers make the decision on what programs would allow a self-assessment in lieu of a C3PAO assessment. So the vast majority of us are going to have to go hire that independent assessor. Much like an ISO 9001 quality certification, or in the aerospace industry, AS 9100, I'm sorry. It'll be similar to those types of activities, just much more intense. And there's a lot more to do in terms of cybersecurity safeguard than there is putting together a quality program. A very small subset of the DIB, 1,300 or so, handle what I call CUI plus. That is CUI related, typically related to critical weapons programs. And in fact, we don't really even know what programs are associated with CUI plus. The DoD has been very reluctant to identify those programs yet. It will have to in the very near future, but a good indication is if you're working on hypersonic missiles or missile defense or nuclear arsenal upgrade or 6th generation fighters and bombers, you're probably handling an even more sensitive subset of CUI. And as such, it requires additional protections, 24 additional protections on top of the 800-171. Those protections are called out in the CMMC framework. And at this level, every 3 years, the government itself, through the DIBCAC, which is the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, the DIBCAC will come in and do a Delta assessment. So we'll achieve a C3PAO certification, then DIBCAC will come in and assess our CMMC Level 3 cybersecurity program. And we'll again have to do an annual affirmation. So this is the model. No matter what type of assessment that you're doing, you have to do an assessment at least every year, and for CUI every 3 years. In order to justify your cybersecurity program through that assessment, you need it well documented. So the organization is going to have to prove that it's implemented these cybersecurity safeguards through documentation, narrative, graphical depiction of the cybersecurity program, and also, in the case of level 2 and level 3, make staff available for interviews. So it's quite a complex undertaking, not just building out the cybersecurity program, but the assessment itself. So all that results in what can be a lengthy process, not only to put the cybersecurity program in place, but the assessment itself as well. So what we're looking on this slide, or on this slide, is a representation of the phasing in of CMMC. So CMMC is not in Department of Defense contracts yet, but it will be in the near future. And there's actually, the DoD has had to undergo what was called rulemaking to make CMMC a reality. So it proposed the framework of CMMC in December of 2023. And it took a year for that framework to go through public comment process, White House oversight, and other sorts of approval mechanisms. And it's the framework has now been finalized. In December of 2024, it was finalized, which means we understand what CMMC looks like. That the model that I depicted on the last slide, the assessment process, who's subject to what controls or what requirements. That's all laid out in the CMMC framework. And so it's technically possible to achieve a CMMC Level 2 certification currently. However, being contractually mandated to do so is a different story. And there's a second part to the rulemaking process, and that's the CMMC contracts rule that needs to be finalized before the DoD can put CMMC obligations in its tier 1 contracts and have the primes be obligated to flow those requirements down through subcontracts. That rule was published in August of 2024, and at some point in calendar year 2025, best guess is sometime Q2, early Q3 calendar year, that contracts rule will be finalized, and the DoD will phase in new and option year contracts varying CMMC accountability requirements. They'll start with phase 1, where CMMC level 1 and level 2 self-assessments and reporting will be required. DoD is not going to backdate or modify existing contracts. These requirements will go into new and option year contracts. So phase 1 is self-assessments. Phase 2, which starts a calendar year after phase 1, will be the requirement for level 2 certification. So the primes at that point will find in their contracts, new contracts, and option years, the requirements to produce a certification at level 2 to the DoD. The primes are also mandated by the framework to sort of wrangle their supply chain, make sure that the cybersecurity safeguard requirements are flowed down appropriately, and so sort of downstream to the or upstream to the supply chain, and then require reporting of the supply chain members to them of their certification. And as we can see, or as you indicated on this graph, the purple line represents how long it would take a small business starting from scratch to put in place a compliant cybersecurity program based on the NIST 800-171 standard to protect CUI. It's a year and a half, maybe more. So the primes know this. They are already asking, obligating members of their supply chains to go pursue CMMC Level 2 certification now before it shows up in the prime's contract in phase 2 of CMMC. So it takes a while, starting from scratch, and like I said, the primes know this and they're already asking. So I wouldn't, if you're a small business subcontractor, I wouldn't pay too much attention to this phase 2. What I would pay attention to is the fact that you can be obligated by your customer already to pursue certification if you handle CUI. Those of us that only handle FCI, the FCI program, FAR 52-20421, is no small feat either. It usually would take us, starting from scratch, 6 months or so to implement a CMMC Level 1 compliant program. So what I've just stated audibly is sort of represented by these bullets up here in this slide. There are 4 total phases of CMMC. Phase 3 is a calendar year after phase 2, and that's where level 3 CUI plus type of certifications will be obligated through contracts, and phase 4 is full implementation. That's a calendar year after phase 3. DoD estimates by 2032, CMMC will have reached what I call steady state. All of us that are obligated to undergo one of those 3-year assessments at that point would have been through at least one of those 3-year assessments. So this is what the timeline looks like. CMMC is not a contractual thing yet, but it will be in very short order. There is no time to waste if you are a member of the DIB getting started on building a cybersecurity program. You're probably already obligated to do so anyway through the FAR clauses or the DFARS clause. All right, this is the timeline. Now, let's talk about level of effort for small businesses to meet these obligations. What we see here are 5 attributes associated with implementation of the safeguards and CMMC assessments. For each attribute, we identify the level of effort with various various units for CMMC Level 1, CMMC Level 2, and CMMC Level 3. So we're going to start from the bottom and work our way up here. In terms of the number of safeguards that need to be implemented, the number of practices, also known as the number of controls. For CMMC Level 1, as we talked about, there are 15. There are 15 colors in that rainbow. For CMMC Level 2, there are 110. For CMMC Level 3, there are 134. However, when we do an assessment, or as we build our blueprints for our cybersecurity program, our castle, it's not enough to take into account the controls themselves. These are high-level overarching requirements, such as you will implement a firewall. But exactly how that firewall is to be implemented is called out in a companion document to the 800.171 standard called the 800.171A, which lists the assessment objectives, or the sort of checklist items for how you go through and make sure through assessment that you have effectively, adequately implemented all these practices. So really where the rubber meets the road with all this is the assessment objectives. For the FAR 52-204-21, there are 59 assessment objectives spread across those 15 safeguards. For CMMC Level 2, for 800.171, there are 320 assessment objectives. And for CMMC Level 3, there are 424 assessment objectives. So in terms of the actual actions that the organization has to take to build that castle, this is the real number here. 59, 320, or 424. So it's a non-trivial process to build out a cybersecurity program, even for CMMC Level 1. And really, you need to develop plans in order to effectively plan out the implementation and make sure that once the program is built, that it's sustainable. So when we talk about building plans, we start by building policies. We capture policies in narrative format. We write them down. So the average amount of time that it takes just to develop the policies is depicted here. Couple days to a week just for Level 1 policy development. It can take several weeks, maybe even a couple of months to develop the policies to develop the plans and policies for a CMMC Level 2 NIST 800.171 based program. And then for Level 3, it can take even longer than that, perhaps half a year or so. And then in terms of taking those plans and policies and making them a reality, and by the way, when I use the word policy, I mean setting a set of expectations for the outcome of a practice implementation. Writing down in policy what our firewall is supposed to look like and supposed to do, as an example. Implementing those plans and policies takes even longer. So for a CMMC Level 1 program, as we depicted on that timeline, it can take 6 months or so. For Level 2, it can take a year and a half, typically. And we have a lot of our own data implementing our own cybersecurity programs, and we have hundreds of clients, thousands of users that use Totem resources. And so we have a lot of empirical data that we can gather. We can say it takes about a year and a half starting from scratch. You can throw money at the problem and reduce this timeline somewhat, but there's a lot of stuff to do. There's 320 boxes to check. So you can only string it so far. For Level 3, for CUI Plus, this graph actually doesn't go far enough to the right to depict how long it would take. It would take at least a year, probably pushing 2 years to implement, starting from scratch, a CMMC Level 3 program. There's that much additional stuff that has to be done. For instance, at Level 3, you need an annual pen testing or simulated attack. You need a continuous monitoring environment and continuous configuration reversion environment. So if IT system component gets out of whack for whatever reason, you need automated processes that step in and reconfigure that component automatically. All right, the million-dollar question, pun intended, how much is all this going to cost? That's depicted here. A small business can expect to pay low 5 figures annually to implement and maintain a CMMC Level 1 compliant program. So between $10,000 and $20,000 typically, even for micro businesses. And we specialize in micro businesses. By the way, we are a micro business, fewer than 10 employees. So that's a realistic number. Depending on the footprint of your environment, you can shrink that number a little bit, but it's thousands of dollars annually and probably more than 10,000. For level 2, those of us that handle CUI, it is pushing a six-figure annual problem to build and maintain that 800.171 based cybersecurity program. We, our parent company, spends anywhere between 75,000 and 100,000 annually on licenses, downtime for us maintaining our plans and doing assessments. We pay third-party managed service providers and managed security service providers to do monitoring and day-to-day operation of our IT system. Even though we're a micro business, it just makes more sense for us to do it that way. So we're saying it's about $100,000, six-figure problem. We also have to tack on to that sort of care and feeding maintenance outlay the fact that we're going to have to pay for an assessment every 3 years. And the DoD estimates that a level 2 assessment will cost a business about $100,000 in the fees that you'll pay to that third-party assessment organization, as well as downtime, lost staff time, preparing for supporting and finalizing the assessment. And so you need to amortize that cost across or in your annual budget. So really you would tack on an additional 30,000 in whatever it costs you to maintain that castle. You need to tack on about an additional 30,000 per year preparing for the assessment. And then the DoD estimates that costs of annual care and feeding costs for level 3 program are about $500,000. So we're talking significant outlay for a cybersecurity program, which in turn means we need to be able to expect significant revenue from working as part of the defense industrial base in order to justify these costs. I'll let you do your own math, but 100,000 annually plus 100,000 plus annually means for us that we need expectations of high six figures, low seven figures annual revenue from the DoD. So there are strategies that we can adopt that can reduce these costs and reduce timeframes. I'll talk about one here in a second, but the DoD acknowledges that this is a significant barrier to entry for those of us that are trying to get into federal government DoD contracting. The DoD acknowledges that. They just perceive the risk of our adversaries compromising our military competitive advantage as worth that barrier to entry, or necessitating that barrier to entry. All right. I know I'm full of good news here, sarcastically speaking. There are silver linings here. There are strategies that you can adopt that reduce the footprint of your what's called covered system, reduce the size that your castle needs to be. And I'll talk about one of those here in a second. There's also the silver lining. The main silver lining for me is that there is a methodology. There's a method to the madness. There's a method of approach here. And that method definitely does not involve, as a first step, going and looking at what technologies or what service that we can procure that solves all the problems. That silver bullet service or technology does not exist, first of all. And any technology can at most only check off about 50% of these objectives. The other 50% is business process related. How do you train your staff? How do you manage risk within the organization? What sort of processes and procedures do you have written down for staff to follow as they use the technologies? So it is definitely not, let's go buy this firewall that fixes all our problems. It doesn't exist. The necessary first step is to wrap, as an organization, your collective heads around the scope of the problem. As an organization, define, and we're looking at topology diagram, a depiction, sort of cartoony depiction of a very typical manufacturer's environment where they had cloud services and on-prem brick and mortar headquarters with various IT components, folks working from home, managed service providers that provide remote administration. The first step is to map the flow of the information that's represented here by these purple dashed lines, and then see what's in scope. See what IT assets you bear protection, and then shrink the footprint of those assets if possible. On this slide, we've represented the really bare minimum IT system that would support handling of CUI in any meaningful way. It's what we call virtual desktop infrastructure. It's actually described in the CMMC rule, and those of us that can adopt an architecture like this can de-scope all the rest of our assets except for the cloud-based assets in which we store, process, and transmit CUI. There's a lot more to this. We actually have whole workshops where we explain virtual desktop implementation and scoping in general. But just know that the silver lining is the first step in the process is to shrink the footprint of your IT system that handles CUI or FCI as small as possible. So with that, another silver lining is there's a lot of companies out there that are out there to help. Totem Technologies is one example, but we're not the only consulting company out there. We do offer a lot of free tools, so we actually have a free tools page on our website. We have an interactive roadmap to CMMC compliance as well. We run quarterly workshops on CMMC Level 1 and CMMC Level 2 readiness, and we also have a virtual desktop infrastructure that we operate, that we provide for those of our clients that can shrink that footprint down to that really minimal, bare bones IT architecture. So that wraps it up. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to opportunity to present, and I'm happy to stick around as long as there are questions. I don't see any in the Q&A panel there, Meredith, but I don't know if you can.
Yes. I'm not seeing any questions yet, but just a reminder that you do have access to the Q&A box in case you have any questions. Maybe we can wait for a couple minutes for those to come through.
Sure.
But I'm glad that you pulled up your resources because this has been extremely helpful for us in the Apex team to get together some guides and things like your roadmap. Maybe if you have the ability, could you pull up the roadmap and show our audience kind
I
of the
sure can.
overview of what that is? Because this is such a helpful tool.
Yeah, so if you go to our website, totem.tech, at the top menu, what we do, the roadmap here, it shows you vertically from top to bottom the natural logical progression or sequence of steps that you would take starting from scratch to get to the point where you're CMMC certified and then can maintain a program going forward. So as you roll over each of these milestones, it'll have a little pop-up here with various free resources and other ways that Totem Tech can help. So you can download, for instance, checklists, you can download policy templates, everything that we put in place, all of the policies and plans that we put in place for our own program, we sort of make generic. I call it genericize them and then publish them for free on our website. So you can download and put those in place or use them as a starting place. For instance, we have an incident response plan template that you can download. So lots of good accesses, lots of good resources here, and you can actually download this if you like as a PowerPoint. So if you forget the URL, you can download it once and you'll have it on your desktop.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that overview. And I really encourage our audience to go and check out this tool. It's very helpful and keeps you a little bit more organized as you're starting this journey because we hear a lot from our clients that it's intimidating and it's a lot to take on all at once. So please utilize these free resources that are available to you. And I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll encourage you to reach out to us at CT Apex if you have additional questions. And Adam, do you have any contact information that we can share in case people have totem specific questions?
We do. So this is our contact information. This is the best bet is to email info@totem.tech. You'll get the quickest response. And we're also on LinkedIn, so you can follow us on LinkedIn. And then this is a cell phone number, so you can text if you're interested.
Perfect. So everyone, write down this information or wait until we send the slides out to you after this webinar. And if you need to follow up, you can. But best of luck as everyone is starting on their CMMC journey. I'm glad that everyone is attending and aware that this is going to be a very hot topic, especially coming up this year with compliance just at the end of the tunnel. So I'll thank you again, Adam, so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. This was a really insightful webinar and how to start and what is expected from our small businesses. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And everyone, I will wish you a great rest of your day, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.